Hey there, welcome back to my channel. Today I'll be showing you how I made the Longhouse from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Ravensthorpe in Assassin's Creed Valhalla serves as your primary hub for the game. Throughout the game you're able to upgrade the settlement, and as you do, it grows. The best example of this in-game is the Longhouse itself, which starts off as a decrepit hot mess when you first arrive in Ravensthorpe. With enough time and investment, however, you can eventually get it to look like less of a hot mess, and more like a longhouse truly fit for a Jarl. Despite what you're seeing in-game, I don't actually have the settlement fully upgraded yet. That's because I've been spending my time doing more important things. Much to my own surprise, I actually made plans for this project. More specifically, I actually took the time to make proper templates for this build. This involved far more measuring than I had ever anticipated, but it was ultimately for the best. I knew that taking the time here to measure things correctly would save me a lot of frustration in the future. Granted, some aspects of the Longhouse do look a little bit off, measurements-wise, but ultimately it worked out. Once the templates were done, it was simply a case of tracing them onto black foam. The thought process behind this was by using black foam I could skip a few steps down the line. And surprisingly, it actually worked. Once I marked out where the walls of the Longhouse would be sitting on the base, it was time for hot glue. Lots and lots of hot glue. At the very start, the only thing keeping the walls up was hot glue, so it very much has the MVP status of this project. The smaller walls for Eivor's room and the entrance were very fiddly, but eventually I was able to get them placed. Despite all of my planning though, I forgot about the deck that sits at the back of the Longhouse, so that gets hot glued onto the base as well. Cutting out the windows was a little bit scary, as I didn't want to crack any of the foam. I knew that that kind of repair would be a pain in the neck, but ultimately it worked out. The doors were the same too, although because they were so close to the base it wasn't anywhere near as nerve-wracking. Time for the part of the project that I initially thought was going to be the hardest bit, the making of the wood panels. Taking some paddle pop sticks, I used a wire brush to scratch in some exaggerated wood grain into each stick. It's subtle now, but it takes a stain and a dry brush really well. Then it's just a case of covering up all the foam. I believe this process took just over 4 hours, spread across multiple days. At the time I believed that this would be the hardest part of the build. I was wrong. Very wrong. I realised that one layer of foam wasn't going to be enough for the base, so I glued another layer onto the bottom. With a bit of trimming, I was then satisfied with the new height. With the walls done, it was then time to turn my attention to the deck. This wasn't anything special really, just shorter panels glued onto the base as opposed to the walls. I will say though, the shorter panels of the wraparound porch were far more annoying to do than the actual deck itself. More annoying than that though was the beams that sit at the front of the Longhouse. I used a thick piece of dowel here, and it was very annoying to cut. Eventually though, that too gets glued into place. That wasn't the last of the wood panels however. In order to hide some of the ugly looking seams, I used cardboard. Since it's so easy to work with, I figured it would be easier to just use the cardboard as opposed to the paddle pop sticks. It was also used to add additional details to the walls. The wood grain I'm scratching into the cardboard here is completely redundant. It gets covered by paint later. As much as this cardboard adds detail, I will admit that some details were omitted from the final build, or may not be completely accurate. Whether that's because of the scale or because I wanted to preserve my sanity is up to you to decide. I also used cardboard for the roofs. The deck roofs were made by gluing 2 pieces of cardboard cut on an angle together, then forcing those into place with more hot glue. I made sure to forget to add the posts holding the roofs up, so that I'd have to rip them off, glue the posts on, and then glue the roofs back on again. Here I cut out a section of the base at the side entrance to prepare for future goop. I then primed all of the places I knew the primer would struggle to reach with black. For the lattice work here I used a piece of this rope net, then closed off the first floor with one large piece of cardboard. The rest of the smaller, more annoying roofs were made the same way. Just more pieces of cardboard cut at various angles. Without hot glue, this would have been impossible to achieve. More fake lattice work with the net rope, and the first floor is done. To cover the ugly seam on the base, I used rocks. I tear some scrap pieces of foam up into little chunks, then throw them into this container. This container is full of rocks, and shaking it will allow me to turn the foam into rocks. Magic, I know. From there it's just a case of gluing the fake rocks onto the base, then giving them a coat of modelling paste, then stippling that paste to make it look more like rock. Time for some of the roof details. I roll out some beans of clay, and then press a mouth into each one. I then roll out a larger bean and press another mouth into it. Then that larger bean gets some nostrils, then some eyes, and then horns. Once baked, the heads get glued onto the front of the longhouse, alongside a simple shield with 2 spears that I made off screen, using more clay and some leftover Warhammer bits. Off screen, I made the top part of the longhouse, using all of the techniques I've already showed. Once glued in place, I carved some XPS foam into a vaguely spine-like shape. I glue the smaller beans onto each side of the spine, then onto the top of the longhouse. Time for the most painful part of this project. I went out and bought these pattern scissors because I knew it was going to be painful regardless, and wanted to save myself some time. Using a combination of the pattern scissors and regular scissors, I created these roof tiles. When stacked on top of each other, it creates the tile effect. This step alone took about 45 minutes. After that, it was just a case of gluing all of the tiles onto all sections of the roof, including the small fiddly bits. This process alone took about 5 hours to do, which was spread over 2 days, not that it made any difference at all. While I'm torturing myself with that, however, I have an announcement. After thinking about it for several months, I have decided to set up a Patreon page for the channel. There are currently 2 tiers at the time I'm recording this. The first tier, Squire, gets you access to videos 1 day before they are posted, your name in the credits of every video, as well as a shout out for when you first become a patron, and access to photos and videos of each completed project. The second tier, Knight, gives you all previous benefits. It also gives you the chance to vote in polls that will decide my projects. You also get to see some behind the scenes stuff, as well as updates and any mistakes I make on my projects. This is completely optional, however. Do not feel obligated to spend your money on me. If you need some further convincing, however, I have a few words from the channel mascot himself. Do you have anything to say to any potential patrons there may be? Okay. There will be a link in the description of this video, and a link in the About section of my channel. So this is editing me here. So it turns out YouTube doesn't let you insert links into the video description until you're verified. However, they do let you insert links in your channel description, so it will definitely be there. Thank you for listening, back to the video. Once the suffering had ended, it was time to cover up all the ugly seams. Pretty much all of the ugly spots were covered in this step. This was especially needed on the roof, as it took it from looking like a hot mess to looking cohesive. All of the cardboard and foam was then covered in a layer of black paint and Mod Podge. I was worried that the primer may not stick to the model without it, so I felt it was best to cover everything that might be a problem. Perhaps I was overthinking it, but I wasn't about to find out the hard way. I then glued the model down to the base and got started on the finishing touches. The earth is raised around the entrances to the longhouse, so I cut and placed a bit of foam at each entrance to raise up the ground a little bit. Then, to no one's surprise, it's time for my favourite ground texturing paste. This gets slathered onto the base very heavily, to the point where it took just over a day to dry completely. The model was then primed black, and then just the longhouse was painted brown. My painting techniques were a little bit different for this project, as I wanted to mimic the weathered look of the longhouse in-game. I did this by starting with a very bright blue on the sides of the longhouse. This was stippled on as opposed to just painting it on. I tried to focus the paint in the centre of each panel, which is where the paint would peel last when exposed to the elements for a long time. I did this for the red sections too, but I painted the roof normally. The roof is going to get covered in greens later, so I didn't want to waste too much time on the details. Speaking of details, this was when I realised that I forgot to add the windows on top of the longhouse. So off camera I quickly made some up and then stuck them on. All of the metals received a black coat, the wooden decks received a brown coat and then a light brown dry brush, the rocks received a light grey, and the earth a dark brown. The rocks then received a heavy-handed light grey dry brush. I then went back over my previous work with lighter versions of whatever colour was used. This was to help sell the weathered effect, and to bring in some variations in the colour. I forgot to film some of the smaller details here, so you'll have to forgive me if some things just happened to pop into existence. The entire longhouse was then bathed in a brown wash to make it look more weathered. This also dulled down the colours significantly, and added a layer of grime that I felt is realistic. The earth got this same brown wash, while the rocks got a black wash. All surfaces of the longhouse were then dry brushed with lighter versions of their respective colours. I ended up going over the red sections with a red wash, however. I felt that the dry brush desaturated the colours too much. With some final little details added, the model was finally painted. Now it was time for some greenery. I started with a thin layer of glue along the base of the model, and then sprinkled on a layer of modelling grass. I don't have a static grass applicator, but I find that sprinkling it on is just as effective. With some more glue, I then start gluing down various bushes and grasses onto the model. I will admit that I went a little overboard with this step. Whilst I appreciate the look of the upgraded longhouse, I do miss the greenery on the unupgraded longhouse, and I wanted to bring back that look for this model. I believe that it's more visually interesting this way, even if it means sacrificing accuracy. With another layer of glue on the roof, I then start placing clumps of foam foliage. There's no reason to where I placed it, I was pretty much just trying to cover up that ugly gap between the two roofs. Plus I felt that the roof would be very boring without it. It was then time for some lichen, using a technique I picked up from Boylai Hobby Time. Using a needle-tipped bottle, I dot some lichen onto the roof using green paint. This is a very simple but effective technique that I will be using again in the future. I then spray the entire model down with isopropyl alcohol, and then watered down glue to seal all of the foliage in. And with that, the model is finished. Thank you for watching! This project, being a larger one, took me far longer than expected, which I consider to be a good thing, as it was a vital lesson in time management for me. I'm hopeful that going forward I'll have a better grasp on how long these projects are going to take, and that I'll be able to use that knowledge to time these uploads a little bit better. Regardless, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Until then, have a good one.